All right. Welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked. I'm Matt Farlow, and I am stoked to be joined once again by Tony Wynn. Phil is on assignment today, and so in his place, we have Jacob Farlow, who's below. And so we're stoked to have Jacob joining Tony and I today, and we're continuing our dialogue into the church and the church's response. And so for those of you who've been joining us through New Wine Uncorked, you know that right there on the bottom of the screen, on either side of Jacob is the opportunity to subscribe to New Wine Uncorked on YouTube. But it's not just a subscription to Uncorked. Actually, it's a subscription to our YouTube page, which then will allow you to get new wine tastings, new wine table talks, as well as our uploads that we have on profiles for journal artists, because New Wine has our journal Cultural Encounters, engagement of culture from a Christ-centered Trinitarian perspective. And so we highlight authors through that. And that's all found on our YouTube page, as well as then going to our Facebook page, New Wine, New Wineskins, and liking that so that you can be made aware of any of the happenings that's going on in and through New Wine. And there are a lot of things going on. Right now, Jacob and I are currently in Folsom, California, and there's a tremendous amount of fires and happenings going on here in California, but that just happened as well up in Oregon where Tony's at, and we're going to discuss this. Today's topic is the empowered church, will to power or power to will. It comes from and is playing off Nietzsche's will to power philosophy, and this idea that many people will get into, and we'll talk a little bit about this maybe today, is the Ubermensch, or this idea of this Superman, and whether or not maybe people in the church or culture today have taken what Nietzsche was pressing into with this idea of the Ubermensch, and how that then plays out in the church. Anytime you look into the modern day church in the 20th century, there is this tension, and we've been talking about this over these last few weeks, this tension of who's in control and what does it mean to be in control. And so before we started recording, the three of us were talking a little bit about one of these stories that came about with Franklin Graham. And he was talking about Donald Trump being the church's almost, he didn't use the language of the messianic figure, but he was talking about Donald Trump being one of the last stands for Christians today, holding back this force, this wall of evil. And it made me think, back in the early mid 1900s with Karl Barth and the group of theologians who signed the Barmen Declaration. And we're talking about, look, because the church had hooked its cart to the nationalism of Germany, and got me thinking in how we've been talking about consumerism, but how has the church hooked its cart to the nationalism of America today? And Franklin Graham was talking about Donald Trump being this last stand. And so is the church allowing for thy will to be its power, or is the church seeking its own power so as to then fulfill its will, power to will? And so Tony, Jacob, this is where we're at. And so in light of everything that's going on, Tony, first of all, your church has been impacted by the fires. So how are things with that? And then after that, how have you seen this play out where the church attempts to commandeer power and push its own agenda? And maybe that's even happening today because now with the fires, that's an added obstacle or issue to work into how to get together in light of COVID-19. And so what is the church today? Is it hooked its cart to American nationalism? And in doing so, has it made it to where it's almost not impossible, but very tough to then step into situations like COVID-19 as well as fires, because we have this nationalistic agenda, but that impacts then our local situation. Tony?
Yeah, so in regards to the fires in Oregon, I've been so moved by the response of the members of my church who've willingly opened up their homes to the community on our city Facebook group page. Church members are offering their plots of land for people to bring their RVs or to camp. People are offering their homes for Wi-Fi, for showering, for shelter. So whatever the need is, I've just been so fortunate to witness the body of Christ really move in that direction, and that gives me so much hope for the sacrificial love that Jesus calls us to. I think to your second question in regards to the American church and power, man, I think the perfect illustration I could see for that outside of Franklin Graham is also Eric Metaxas. So a couple of weeks ago, when President Trump held the RNC like final convention night on the White House lawn, which is against multiple legal precedents where he broke the law by holding the convention on the lawn. We have this perfect illustration of the relationship of American evangelical Christians to the wider society and culture. There's this clip whereas the members who attended the convention were leaving the White House. There's a protester who rides his bike right by the White House and everybody who's leaving, and he throws the F-bomb. And he throws a slur at President Trump. And so you see Eric Metaxas run up to the guy and sucker punch him. And I think that's the perfect illustration of American evangelicalism's reaction to the wider culture and society. Because if you were just to take that clip, you'd go, oh, Eric Metaxas is responding to an agitator. But in the wider context, no, it's Trump and evangelicals who are agitating. Somebody responds, and then evangelicals escalate. But we have these isolated moments captured where we see evangelicals being the responders and somebody else being an agitator. But that's not the full story. And I mean, Eric Metaxas is widely known for his bastardization of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And that flows also into like the evangelical American Christian mindset of like martyrdom. We love martyrs because it feeds into our persecution complex as American Christians. And I think what we see is we never want to be persecuted or martyred ourselves, but we always use people who experience true martyrdom as a red herring, as a warning to say, you know, those guys, Jesus bless them, but we never want to be like that. So we need to consolidate power. And I think that the Christian language behind stewardship is so abusive in the United States because we say we want to steward power. God has given us power to steward. And so we cloak it and layer our infatuation with power in really religious language, and we obfuscate it. And so I think when we look at the biblical narrative, if we were to take an honest look at the biblical narrative, there's more giving up of power than a stewardship of power when we look at God's people and we look at Jesus himself. And with American Christians, the obsession with power and stewarding power has totally rotten us to our core. And so, yeah, the Eric Metaxas sucker punching a protester is for me. I can't find. I smile because I can't. Like, that's the epitome of our cultural moment as Christians in the United States. So yeah, that's where I see it.
I know when some of these things happen, it's not that we laugh at it as if it's comical. It's almost as if it's so tragic we don't know what to do but laugh, and sort of we're like laughing out of almost an embarrassment as to this is the portrayal, especially with someone like Metaxas, who has a national platform through his writing and through his books, and who at one time had a fairly, not, I don't know what adjective we want to use, straightforward or normalized understanding, but then for some reason, and my take on Metaxas is it's power. Once you get a big enough platform, you start to say stuff, and he started to realize, oh, when he speaks and tweets, people are really listening and they're taking on. And so I feel like he got consumed by that. And you see that. What person who is writing from an evangelical leadership would think that it's appropriate to go up to a protester and hit them? I just, yeah, it's almost, it's baffling to the point of, you don't know what to do but laugh, kind of chuckle out of like this apprehension, like, oh my gosh. As far as power is concerned, Jacob, we talked about power before, just in our conversations, and how is it that power though is consuming? And then in light of the church, with this faith thing, there is power in faith, but it's a different power. But how does a human sort of addicted to power in your estimation?
I would say recently, with the political arena and all the occurrences of, it seems to me, frenzied and just too loud. It's kind of compensating for something deep at the bottom of, I don't know if it's a lack of something, or I would say it's compensatory. But back to power, I would say it's the power to will instead of the will to power, because Nietzsche talks about the will to power, and it's an artistic expression of life, invigoration of life, to accentuate or enhance all things life in a poetic kind of bringing forth. I would say the will to power itself in America, especially in America, is a will that wills itself. It is a overusing and exhaustive will that ends up devouring the person who's willing, and also the notion of will or anything that is metaphysical. To the addiction of power, I would say it's the same as it's its own ideology. You lose the individual or anything that was of the individual on the onset of power, or the addiction of power. They melt away, and you see remnants, or a skeleton that is a puppet in a way, to this. I don't really know. It's just power, I guess. It's just the dark subterranean beast, one could say, that is always there. The reptilian creature in the abyss. But yeah, it's I think it's kind of like it's the motif of America. We the American dream is white picket fence, car, family, dog, but that's all built upon a first a utilitarianism, and then a materialism that all that underpins it is a power, is a will to power, is a power to will. And in that, it's a dispensing with people as peoples, or as they possess personhood, or they have personhood. They become objects, and everything is objectified. And I think that's what's happened in the church. Is the church itself, and the path to power, or to aggrandizement, it's objectified itself.
And in that, and this goes back to what last week, Tony, you were talking about too, with this. It's enticing. It is like this drug of power, and we've seen it. Anyone that's been in the pastorate has seen it, where all of a sudden a pastor or a leader gets a taste, a smell, something of power, and it just consumes them. Like Jacob saying, it's, they become almost the object of power. Power now starts to control them like a marionette, and dangles. And in the leadership, the growth of the church in the 20th century, though, we have figures like Donald Trump, like Franklin Graham, like Eric Metaxas, like John MacArthur, like the happenings that have been going on with Sean in Bethel. This maybe this what we're putting out there is this prototype of leadership. The problem is how does it then correlate and connect and compare to the leadership of Jesus, who had significant power? The question is did he power himself to will himself to then take care of the people, or was it the will of heaven that was leading because he was leading from the Father? And again, like you were talking earlier, Tony, this language gets confiscated. The leaders of today are exceptionally cunning in the sense that they know the Bible enough. And I almost think that they know that the people of the church don't know the Bible enough to where they can put this stuff out there, and people in the church are such nominal Christians. And I know people are going to go, oh my gosh, look, he's judging and everything. Fine. Okay. Give me evidence, because we tend to say to Jesus, give us evidence that you are real. And he, like Metzger likes to say, he provides the facts, and he says, where's the evidence in our lives? And so what has been, in your estimate, the church's response, though, to this power, especially because 60 days away, 52 days or so away from this new election for the president, and we're seeing the rhetoric for power ramp up, and thus we've seen Franklin Graham was just on there again, like I opened with, saying that Donald, actually using that language, that Donald Trump is the last stand. So what has been missing, or what has caused the church to lose her way in some sense, to think that her power is actually found in these worldly, earthly things? As Jacob was saying, the American dream, we put up these neat things, and yet really is the American dream just a grasping for power, which is just an overflow of where they're getting, the church. People think, well, if the church is seeking power, shouldn't I be seeking power in my own life?
Yeah, I think along with what Jacob said, some of the research I've been doing in regards to what does it mean to be a pastor in contemporary America is, I think for so long, for the last 40, 50 years, whether it's been explicitly stated or implicitly implied, a pastor had to be entrepreneurial. When you look at the mega church movement and seeker sensitive movement, pastors had to be innovative and entrepreneurial. It was, what do you do with the power that you have? How do you exercise the power that you have? How do you market the power that you have? But I think in interrogating that, something that I'm finding that is needed for pastors today, whether you're white or black or a person of color, is pastors need to be engaging in decolonial theory. And everybody always gets antsy with that because they're saying, are you adding something to the gospel? It's like, well, no, I'm not adding anything to the gospel. I'm saying that the gospel has something for decolonial work. I think where we're failing with racial reconciliation, where we're failing with multi-ethnic, multicultural church movements in the United States, is because we fail to interrogate our origins. We kind of see ourselves as ex nihilo, that we came out of nothing. But we didn't come out of nothing. We came out of something, whether we trace it to the 1400s and the Papal Bull splitting the New World between Portugal and Spain, and the creation of race, or we trace it to Marx's critique of capitalism in England and the UK, to today, how we see how the Latin American churches and Hispanic churches respond to imperialism. I think there are touchstones for us to do pastoral work to fight back against the seduction of power. And so that's why I think for seminaries, it's one thing to read a James Cone book and say that is liberation theology. It's another thing to actually train our pastors to fight back against empire, to not only be religious priests within the empire, but actually work towards dismantling the empire. And for some people, that sounds like coded language. That sounds like whistleblowing or an alarmist view. But I think for so long, the American church has been blind or oblivious to the ways that it is, in fact, a part of the empire. When we talk about how capitalism grew as a parasite upon Western Christianity, a large part of American Christianity is intricately tied to capitalism. And this is why we're seeing anybody who supports Black Lives Matter become accused of Marxism as antithetical to capitalism. We don't interrogate our systems. And so I think within the church, we need to learn from decolonial theorists. And oftentimes what we find is those decolonial theorists have a background within the faith. But we would just call them heretics because they lean towards socialism rather than capitalism. But I'm finding wonderful mentors in the Roman Catholic Church, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, in Karl Barth as a socialist and a Protestant. There are pastors and theologians and spiritual formation leaders who have offered us a wealth, a treasure trove, to combat against the empire and not lose our soul to power.
Yeah. And identity, this goes into identity of the church, but also the identity of the individual. And, Nietzsche talks about that, but also identity comes into many of the philosophers and many of the folks that were wrestling in the late 1800s and early 1900s with identity and who we are as people, whether we are commodifying one another and simply using in the mindset of the utilitarian philosophy, or are we stepping into that relationality, that being in communion with one another? And it plays out today. We see this politically as well as just socially, how we interact with each other, especially in light of COVID-19, the Black Lives Matter protests, how we receive each one of our own actions and somebody else's actions, that whether we agree with them or not tends to be whether we like that person. It's based on preference, and we don't even look at it objectively as to the actions behind it. And so in this push for power, power is one of the key aspects, but I think also comes about with the commodification of one another is the propaganda that spills out of a power-driven church or power-driven faith. I was just reading in one of the articles, and it reminded me of L. Ron Hubbard, and he was talking about becoming rich, and one of the fastest and easiest, not easy, but quickest ways to, I guess that's redundant, fastest and quickest, but to get rich was to have your own religion. And he wanted to do it in the likes of the medieval Catholic Church and what had happened, and so came about that. And so I'm wondering, Jacob, too, with some of these philosophers and some of the critiques maybe of religion, but still wanting a religion, this continued push, you see it throughout the centuries and throughout history, this wrestling with this tension of who we are as people in community, but also then this swallowing up of the individual by community, and how that's played out and how it continues to play out today.
I would say there's if there is such a thing, a religious impulse that, we all hit on. I think it's the religious stage or the ethical stage for Kierkegaard. But I would, the community and then the consuming of the individual and the community, it's I would say it's like well, first we need to look at, well, history, and I don't know if we can do this correctly in any way, because we're looking back in the 21st century and to, you know, it's kind of warped from the beginning. But I would say uh, in any way, like what Tony said, it is kind of like a challenging, or the question that is thrown upon us by what has been. We need a weird, if you will, a hermeneutics of the church, like or of Christianity. But it starts with a destructuring, like a delimiting to see where we reach to or where we don't, or the effects um, even. And I feel like when that occurs, uh, you see the patterns or uh, the themes that emerge, and one of them is the continued need to be with, or um, like a participation in, and because you can't act upon, or I think it's Paul Tillich, right? You have to act in order to act upon, and we need the participation, but it can't be like observing or spectating. It can't be for our entertainment to participate, just something to do to block out the boredom or the silence. It needs to be a solace, but also challenging. It needs to awaken or rise certain things and questions that we wouldn't ask ourselves, because not that we're weak, but we like to deny ourselves important questions. And I feel like uh, in the era right now of politics, we see that a lot. I think there's a scene in Macbeth where he's losing his mind, and he points to a ghost he sees, and his wife or the queen says it's the painting of the past, or it's the portrait of your own pain, kind of thing. And it is a projection of our innermost, the things we see as disgusting, and yet they're still a part of us. And so we have to recognize that in others, that the only reason I'm feeling disgust for someone is because I recognize myself so much in the other person. And I think when we get to that, we realize how communal we are, how relational we are, and our need for participation.
Mm.
And so, in the hermeneutics of the church, I think it starts with attunement, like an authentic attunement. So we attune to people, not as things, but as they are in their personhood.
Mm.
Jacob, I would love to ask, because I don't think I'm that much older than you, but I think you offer me some wisdom that man, I'm so vibing off of. And so when you look at our current culture and society within the United States, where do you see progress or change taking place? Because I think oftentimes with American evangelicals or with American Christians, we are very focused on the bifurcation of creation and society, and we'll say it's sacred and secular. But I think that's a false binary. I think if binaries are ever good, I think the more accurate binary would be sacred and sacrilegious. Whether it's Rob Bell or Hegel, everything is spiritual. And so I think that's what we need to recapture, is that it's not an us versus them. Like you said, it's a participation. It's all of us. So it can never be from a position or a posture of entertainment where you can opt in and out. But wherever real change or real work takes place, it has to be participatory. And so from your vantage point, where do you see real change and real progress taking place?
I would say most change that occurs, not particular to the 21st century, but it usually adheres to like a template of change or progress. And there's certain things right now that still does that, adheres to um, and like a old kind of, I wouldn't say obsolete version of progress, but a template. It's kind of formulaic. And so there's areas though that you see a breaking away from the red and the blue, and it's a coming together, and it's a mix. It's like it's, you know, it's political, but it's walking the line of apolitical. Um, and so I would say that's the real change. It's the breaking away from uh, seeing each other as genus and seeing each other as human, as another person, but as a being, really. The thing that supersedes the subject object calculus kind of thing. It's the superordinate, which is the being, or something more, I guess, uh, ontological. I don't know, something like that.
No, that's so good, because that if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're encouraging all of us to do is to get into dialectics, that we all need to move towards a thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Totally.
Yeah, or the mediation or reconciliation, as it were, for Kierkegaard.
Yeah. Well, we were just talking about the dialectic, right, Jacob? Like, because the playing out in my doctoral work, I took Barth, but I also, in his theological premise and the foundation, Christological and also pneumatological, but it's also very ecclesiastical, you know, in the sense that it pushes into the church, but it's Christocentric and spirit-led. But then combine that with Balthasar, who's a Catholic theologian, and the Catholics, I know people, I teach, you know, theology for university students, and so often it just the claim that, oh, well, this person is Catholics, but they're not Christian. And I'm like, you don't understand. But it's just playing out this dialectic in the sense of we have to have an antithesis. And that's not the proper use of the dialectic, where this ex nihilo, like the idea of out of nothingness, we actually then seem to believe that we can be these originators, these creators out of the church. And then what we don't realize is subtly what we're creating is a God in our own image, you know? And so, like Jacob was saying, in this idea or this dialectic where we have to be willing to step back and go, but what is the antithesis of myself? What is it that I continue to wrestle with? And instead of wrestling within, I project out. And so then instead of being with, we tend to be two things. And because when we treat the other as a thing, ultimately what we're doing is we're treating myself as a thing, especially in light of Christ's words that says you are to love the other as yourself, right? So there is a love of neighbor, but first that comes after love God and love self. And if ever anyone would admit that they treat themselves like a thing, I think we'd step back and go, really? How do you treat yourself that way? You always elevate self. And it's this idea that I think gets lost in the church. And so I'm thankful that both of you are like even wrestling in it, because it challenges me too. But how is it to break through that, so that because the folks that are in power right now are not seeing that. They want to commodify the other. They want to utilize the other. They want to become empowered in themselves so as to have power over the other and not empower the other from underneath. And so how does that get broken though?
Yeah, I think from my vantage point, I would say um, you have to walk away from the masters of production and the market. And so we see that in Exodus, where the Israelites are like, all right, we're doing our first union. Like, we're out. And so, I mean, it really is a divestment from evangelicalism. And some will say, oh, wow, that's really harsh. That's really, that's too radical. But I would say, no, I think it's a great mercy. It's out of love for our brothers and sisters who have been captured by power, to say we will no longer play the status quo game. It's no longer quid pro quo. It's no longer I get some, you get some, but I will totally divest of this power so that it's in the hopes and in prayer that you will be liberated from that power and you are no longer enslaved by that power, because that's how our power works. It's insidious. It leads us to believe that we're in control, but we're not. We're being controlled. And so, and I mean, yeah, Matt, with what you were saying with the dialectic, we think we're creating from nothing, but in reality, if we were to take the dialectical tool to its furthest conclusion, it's not that we're created from nothing, but now because we've slotted ourselves in as the primary subject and object, we are actually being created into nothing. So it's Bart with desnectiki. It's nothingness. In our obsession with power, we are becoming nothing, and we're doing it to ourselves. But God wants to create something new. And so, yeah, I think for me, it begins with a divestment from power. It's starting a holy riot and walking away from the masters of production and capital.
Yeah, and I think when people hear that, the people that cringe from that, and I think if we're being honest, tend to have lighter skin and typically have testes, you know, because they're like, oh my gosh, you're trying to take my power, and because we've been taught, if you conceal it, it's like it's the power's put into the sack, and it's like who's got the most power, kind of thing, and this consumption of power makes them crazy. When we see this, you see Metaxas thinking that it's just okay at a rally for the president when they want to pin their hopes to this evangelical savior. He thinks it's okay to go and beat the crap out of someone just because they're protesting, which in light of what they're saying their history is, the Christians of all people should be championing protest in the light of what someone doesn't believe, standing up for their convictions, but this protest, and I feel like what's happening is the church is almost protesting against itself without even realizing it's the Ouroboros, right? Eating their self alive and not even realizing that it's their own tail that they're eating, or that they are the frog in the pot, and they're like, I'm smelling like maybe we have frog, legs tonight. They're like, what? And they're not realizing that they're eating themselves. And I wonder, though, because we've talked about this a little bit in our New Wine UnCorked, and Jacob, you and I have talked about this change. People think change is tearing down monuments, but when we're talking about a systemic evil, the only way for that to go away is for there to be a systemic change. I'm not sure if any leader, I'm fairly confident that any leader in control right now wants nothing of that change, because a systemic change would tell the people, regardless of gender, regardless of color, regardless of age, that you who are leading must be altered, you might transformed. And so this idea of change, Jacob, you brought it up, in the Ouroboros, like the eating of the self. How is change even possible, though, if people are so blinded by their own selfishness, their own consumption?
I actually want to touch on the what was it? The annihilating force, or into nothingness. I really think the power to will, because I don't want to distort the will to power, even though it has a history of its own. I would say I feel like it's a covering, it's a tarping, a momentary tarping of, I don't want to say nihilism, but he's a nihilist, dude. But
hey man, the German socialists, you gotta appreciate that. At least have a sorry the quotation for anyone who.
Okay, I would say say it's like it's a tarping of annihilating force. So it is the siren of the nothingness, or but I think that is because we haven't really responded to, I don't want to, it's kind of arrogant to say this, but I don't think the church has responded to Dostoevsky and Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, like fully. I know people have tried to bring Stoicism into Christianity, and it's turned into a weird Platonism, but no one realizes it's Platonism kind of thing, where it's just this weird uh, drowning in ideality. It's just idealism, and it's too much because we neglect this world, which in turn neglects the humans or beings in the world. And without that, it is like a weird, um, it, it turns into efficiency. It turns into how much I can get done, how much good can I get on my, like punch card or whatever. It's the good is then the efficient, and the righteous is productivity. It's a weird modernization, and even we see it in language where it's uh, instrumentalized. We have these automatic phrases, and it is kind of mechanism fuck, my bad.
Stick.
Mechanismic now. Yeah, I can't speak, but I really think it's uh we veil so much over um like the power itself, and so we become blind to it, as Tony said. It is the Ouroboros. We consume ourselves, our own tales, uh, but it's because in the veiling um, we close off any other forms of revealing. It's it's a discard for uh, poetry. I think any form of uh, there's waves and trends of music, and it kind of goes with this where it is a a ordering or a narrowing of ways of manifestation. And I just feel like that's happening in language, it's happening in theology, even philosophy. We've demarcated the continental and the analytical. It's thinking. We're thinking thought. We don't need like systems are great, but when that occurs, you just end up in the long run trying to plug in things to labels, and you lose the person for or the thing in itself, as it were.
And no, Jacob, I that forgive the pun, but that's money right there. I mean, when we talk about Nietzsche and we talk about the death of God, I think for Americans and American Christians, we don't have an answer to that, because when we answer that, we'll realize that we're the ones that killed God. It's why is God dead? It's because Christians, American Christians, have killed him, and that's the part of the market and capital. I think we are the monster in Pan's labyrinth with the eyes on our hands. We can't see what we've done with our hands because we only see through the perspective of production, and so we, in very theological terms, we see this in the way we take communion. Communion is very much a Fordian experience of production and an assembly line of the cup and the wafer. And it's, yeah, we've killed God. And we're too afraid to ask the question, that Nietzsche proposes and Dostoevsky proposes, because we will find that we are the culprits. And that drives us to insanity, because when we realize that we've killed God, where does that leave us? Because our faith is hinged on somebody else killing God.
Yep.
So that's money, dude. That was money.
It's like
Can I say something else? I want to, because I feel like in the realization that we were at least complicit in the death of God, it leads to I don't know if this is correct, but the original revelation, where it is where we're held out into the anxiety or suspended in anxiety, and the only thing that I think is not a cure, but at least alleviates anxiety is communal activity. It is the active participation. It is the hug, the hand on the shoulder, talking, but authentically using language in attunement to the other person with aporia. It is the viscosity that manifests through language to reveal in a truthful manner.
Yep. And it's interesting. I mean, both you brought up this idea. We systemize each other, and then we're surprised that we have systemic evils, and we individualize each other, and then we're surprised that we don't have a communal truth to us. And then what happens is this veiling of truth, and we see that around. This is one of the first times, at least in my life, and I'm not that old, 40s, and of the presidency actually having a group that follows the president to take account of all the non-truths that he's saying. We all know politicians lack the ability to speak fully in truth, but this is one of the first times, at least in my life, where we have a truth counter or a non-truth counter, right? And we actually had a president come out and say, don't believe what you hear, what you see. We'll tell you what is truth. Well, that's the irony is this is coming, the evangelicals have hitched their wagon to this, and yet they don't realize that even Pontius Pilate understood truth more so than the evangelical church today. You know, what is truth? And he was in somewhat rhetorically saying, because truth is standing right next to me. I don't understand this because the church didn't allow that, because like both of you said, the church was the one nailing this dude to the cross. How often does that happen today, right? Continually. And we're going to continue this discussion in next week. Maybe we'll have Jacob continue and join us with Phil, because this talk of unveiling the truth, stepping back into the truth of thy will, so to power the church, as opposed to the power of me willing myself to will to power, you know, and taking this aspect of this human construction, you know. And so folks, those of us in the evangelical circles, you know, when we cringe at this talk of, oh, they're pushing from the left, this socialistic or the Marxist, go and read Marxism. Go and read Marx and see if what people purport as Marxism is even what he was talking about. It's the same thing with any of our philosophers, any of our theologians. Go to the original source. And for those of us who are believers in this Christian God, the original source would be the Bible. So you can't understand if someone like Metaxas is abusing, or Trump is abusing, or Graham is abusing the scripture if you yourself don't know it. We don't know it. So this constant pursuit of truth. And so, like we've talked today, this will to something, okay? What is the power source of you? What's the power source of me? And where do we get that? So we're thankful that each one of you has joined the three of us for this constant, continual dialogue of, well, who we are and who the church is, and what is the power source that each one of us are living from. Is it self, or is it Savior, or is it a conglomeration of the two? And how is it that we either worship and elevate that, or we distort it based on our own selfish, whatever, you know, motivations? And so on behalf of Tony and Jacob, we totally appreciate you joining us this day with everything. You know, stay healthy, because there's a lot of things going on outside with the world, and it's pressing in on us. And so we need, as Jacob was saying, we need this communal truth in order to help lift and support one another. And so we're thankful again. Make sure you go right there before the end of this kicks over to the next video. Subscribe to New Wine on YouTube so that you can be updated and informed. And if you don't have the ability for YouTube videos, go to anchor.fm and look up New Wine, New Wineskins, or the New Wine Cast. It's our podcast that takes this and allows you to then listen to it via the podcast. It's on Google Podcasts, it's on Spotify. You can find it there, and you can listen to myself and Tony and Jacob all afternoon. Go back and just put it on repeat, because this is just good stuff, and we appreciate it. And so on behalf of Tony, on behalf of Jacob, I'm Matt Farlow. This has been New Wine UnCorked, another episode, and we'll see you next week on the flip side.